In the 1950s, a new class of aircraft carriers were ordered for the United States Navy. They were to be the largest ever built, some 25% larger than the World War II period Midway class that preceded. Named after the first United States Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, the Forrestal Class was made up of the Supercarriers Forrestal, Ranger, Independence, and Saratoga. 16th of December 1952, at the New York Naval Shipyard in Brooklyn, New York, the keel of what will become the second of the Forrestal class of supercarriers is laid. Classified as Attack Aircraft Carrier CV60, she will become USS Saratoga, the sixth US Navy ship to carry the name, and the second aircraft carrier following Saratoga CV3, a Lexington-class aircraft carrier commissioned in 1927. Compared to the Midway class that preceded, the Forrestal class were a marked step up in scale. A 25% greater displacement, angled flight deck and a much larger island were the obvious differences. But most importantly, whereas the Midway class carried an air wing of 65 to 75 aircraft, the Forrestal class were designed to carry 80 to 100 aircraft. The class had a waterline length of 1,070 feet, a waterline beam of 129 feet and a draft of 36 feet. At 100 feet longer and 20 feet wider than the Midway class, they provided for a much more stable platform during flight operations, even in rough seas, and despite their huge size, could still make a top speed of 34 knots. On October 8, 1955, USS Saratoga was launched, and following fitting out, she was commissioned into service on the 14th of April 1956, under the command of Captain Robert Joseph Straw. 18th of August 1956, and Saratoga sailed for Cuba and the naval base at Guantanamo Bay for her shakedown cruise. This followed a number of months carrying out structural and engineering tests, flight operations and gunnery tests. Following these tests, she returned to New York Naval Shipyard for further work, and she would remain there until the 28th of February 1957. Eventually, she would be back out at sea on a training cruise around the Caribbean before being dispatched to her home port of Naval Station Mayport in Florida. Presidential approval for Saratoga came on the 6th of June 1957, when President Dwight D. Eisenhower, accompanied by members of his cabinet, boarded her to observe firsthand what this new carrier could do. 2 days were spent working alongside 18 other vessels, carrying out flight operations, demonstrations of guided missiles and anti-submarine warfare. Also marking the presidential visit, 2 Vought F-8U Crusaders departed Essex-class carrier USS Bonhomme Richard that was positioned off the US west coast in the Pacific Ocean, and following a 3-hour, 28-minute flight crossing the US, landed on the deck of Saratoga in the Atlantic Ocean. To show her status at the forefront of US military power, she became part of the United States Navy Nuclear Strategic Deterrence Force. She became one of only 6 US carriers to successfully launch the Regulus-1 nuclear-capable, turbojet-powered second-generation cruise missile. In September 1957, Saratoga was to leave US waters and cross the Atlantic Ocean for the first time, destined for the Norwegian Sea and the 10-day major NATO naval exercise Strikeback. Exercise Strikeback was the most ambitious undertaking carried out by NATO so far, and involved over 200 ships, 650 aircraft and 75,000 personnel, operating from Norway in the north to Turkey in the south. Its intention was to simulate responding to an all-out Soviet attack on NATO. Much of the 1960s was spent transiting between the Mediterranean Sea as part of the US 6th Fleet and the Florida coast. On the night of the 24th and 25th of May 1960, Saratoga suffered her first mishap. She had visited Hampton Roads Navy Yard in Virginia to take on ammunition and was sailing south, ready to undergo exercises off Florida. At the same time, the 6,000-ton German cargo vessel MV Bernd Leonhardt was sailing from Trinidad, bound for Baltimore. 33 miles off the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and despite the calm seas and good sailing conditions, the two ships collided, The freighter came off the worst and damaged her bridge and superstructure, and Saratoga suffered damage to her port flight deck as the burnt Leonhardt scraped down her side. Both vessels' owners blamed the other for the collision, but in the end, the United States paid for the repairs to the German freighter. 23rd of January 1961, and a more serious and tragic mishap occurred. While sailing through the Mediterranean Sea as part of the 6th Fleet, a fuel line ruptured within her No. 2 machinery space. The fire was quickly brought under control, but sadly 7 lives were lost due to the fire. She sailed to Athens in Greece for a full assessment of the damage to be carried out, before returning to the US for repair. Upon return to service in 1964, she was back in the Med and carried out several cruises, visiting many ports as she did so. All of these were successful and uneventful, but that would change in June of 1967. On the 5th of June 1967, the Third Arab-Israeli War commenced. The Belmont-class technical research ship USS Liberty was positioned in international waters off the Sinai Peninsula, and on the 8th of June she came under attack by Israeli Navy mortar torpedo boats, as well as Israeli Air Force fighter aircraft. 34 crew were killed in the attack and 171 injured. The Liberty was severely damaged. Saratoga was immediately ordered to the eastern Mediterranean, where her medical facilities were used to treat the survivors of the attack. Israel later apologized to the United States, claiming that USS Liberty was mistakenly identified as an enemy vessel. By December of 1967, Saratoga was back in Mayport, and she wouldn't be heading back across the Atlantic until July of 1969. This allowed time for an overhaul and a modernisation programme to be carried out. The close of the 1960s would see Saratoga have a couple of run-ins with the Soviet Navy. As she was en route across the Atlantic for her 9th Mediterranean deployment, she passed very close to a Soviet surface force, as well as a November-class submarine. And when she passed the Azores, Soviet long-range aircraft based out of Kipilovo began shadowing her. Saratoga's response was to launch interceptors to escort them for as long as they remained in the vicinity of the aircraft carrier. 8th of May 1972, and Saratoga arrives at the Philippines and the Subic Bay Naval Base. She would spend 7 days there replenishing her stocks and supplies before departing for Vietnam, arriving at Yankee Station on the 18th of May. From here, she would launch her aircraft for strike missions over North Vietnam, and for the remainder of the year she would find herself on station several times, and she was also reclassified as a multi-purpose aircraft carrier, CV60. On the 7th of January 1973, following hundreds of sorties, she left Yankee Station and returned to Subic Bay. Following replenishment, she set sail west, via Singapore and back to the United States and Mayport, arriving on the 13th of February 1973. 1975, and Saratoga has returned to duty with the Atlantic Fleet and embarked on several Mediterranean cruises as she saw out the decade. Following a brief and 16th Mediterranean deployment, on the 28th of September 1980, Saratoga sailed for the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. There, she became the first ship to undergo a major overhaul known as the Service Life Extension Programme. 28 months later, and following sea trials, the overhauled and rejuvenated Supercarrier left Philadelphia to continue her service. In August of 1985, Saratoga set sail into the Atlantic bound for Europe and her 18th Mediterranean deployment. It was scheduled to be a routine deployment. However, things turned out anything but routine. On the 7th of October, the Italian cruise liner Achille Lauro, which was sailing from Alexandria to Port Said in Egypt, was seized by 4 members of the Palestinian Liberation Front. They instructed the ship's captain to sail for Tartus in Syria, whilst demanding the release of 50 Palestinians from Israeli prisons. Following the refusal by Syria to dock at Tartus, the hijackers issued a warning that they would begin executing hostages if their demands were not met. Their demands continued to be refused, and so they singled out 69-year-old wheelchair-bound Jewish-American tourist Leon Klinghoffer. He was executed on the stern of the ship and thrown overboard. Frustrated at being refused entry into Syria, the hijackers ordered the ship to return to Port Said, where they entered tense negotiations. They finally agreed to leave the ship and release all hostages in exchange for their safety. It was agreed to allow them to board an Egypt Air Boeing 737 and head for Tunisia. Day 4 of the incident, and on the 10th of October, USS Saratoga received orders from US President Ronald Reagan to intercept the airliner. 7 F-14 Tomcats were scrambled from the deck of Saratoga, and they were supported by an E-2C Hawkeye as well as tanker support of Grumman Ka-60 air tankers. Off the coast of the Greek island of Crete, the F-14s eased up behind and to the side of the 737. Once in position, they dipped their wings in the international signal for a forced landing, whilst at the same time the Hawkeye radioed the crew of the airliner, instructing them to follow the F-14s to the US Naval Air Station at the Italian base of Sigonella, Sicily. Upon arrival, the 4 hijackers were arrested by Italian authorities, and all the interceptor and support aircraft returned safely to Saratoga, bringing the action to a close. Just 6 months later, however, Mediterranean tensions rose once more. Tensions between the United States and Libya had been building for some time, and the Libyan president, Colonel Gaddafi, had drawn an imaginary line off the coast, marking out contested territory at the edge of the Gulf of Sidra. He referred to this line as the Line of Death. Under international freedom of navigation rules, the United States Navy intended to continue its operations in the area, and on the 23rd of March 1986, aircraft from the US carriers Coral Sea, America and Saratoga crossed the Line of Death. The following day, 3 US Navy warships also crossed the same line, as well as more F-14 Tomcat aircraft. Just 2 hours later from the coastal town of Sirte, Libyan forces launched SA-5 Gammon surface-to-air missiles at the US aircraft. On this occasion, all the missiles missed their targets and impacted the sea. Considered to be a breach of international law and an unwarranted aggression, the US launched a defensive move, in which aircraft from Saratoga took part. Libyan missile patrol boats were targeted within the Gulf of Sidra and attacked with Rockeye cluster bombs as well as Harpoon anti-ship missiles. The base at Sirte from where the Gammon missiles were launched was also targeted, and 2 A-7 Corsair II aircraft destroyed a key radar installation. Towards the end of the 1980s, Saratoga was due another overhaul. But before her return to the US, on the 22nd of September 1987, an unfortunate incident occurred during the NATO exercise Display Determination 87. At Aviano Air Base in Italy, a United States Air Force RF-4C Phantom had taken off and was tasked with hunting USS Saratoga's battle group. To register a kill, it would have to locate the carrier and carry out a low pass, close enough to read the hull numbers. In support of the Phantom was a KC-135 tanker, and when this was picked up by Saratoga's radar, 2 F-14 Tomcats were scrambled and vectored onto the target. At the controls of one of the F-14s was Lieutenant Timothy Dorsey. He approached behind the tanker to find that it was in the process of refuelling the Phantom. Satisfied that it was a friendly, he remained in position, and the Phantom crew were aware that there was a pair of F-14s behind them, but again recognised them as friendlies and were unconcerned. The Phantom finished its refuelling, broke off and resumed its hunt for Saratoga. The F-14 of Lieutenant Dorsey followed. Approximately 20 miles out from Saratoga, the crew of the Phantom spotted their target and initiated a simulated attack run. Dorsey radioed Saratoga to report an inbound and request instructions. The reply came back with a commonly used exercise phrase of "read and free on your contact." In the frantic tension of the moment, Dorsey became confused and interpreted the response as real world, not exercise. In the back seat, his radar intercept officer, still confident that this was exercise, confirmed the order to shoot. Dorsey selected a sidewinder and squeezed the trigger. The Rio in the back seat was horrified to hear a whoosh 1 second and then a second later see the Phantom's rear end engulfed in a ball of flame. Fortunately, the 2 crew on board the Phantom promptly ejected before the flaming F4 hit the ocean. They were subsequently rescued by search and rescue and taken on board the very ship they were supposed to attack as an exercise. Following a $280 million overhaul at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, Virginia, she was back in service, and in late 1990, tragedy would strike her crew. On the 21st of December 1990, whilst moored off the coast of Haifa, Israel, 102 of her crew had been ashore and were returning to the ship on board an Israeli chartered ferry. It was just past midnight, and as the ferry was just 200 yards from Saratoga, the crew began moving to the exit side of the vessel. The sea was rough that evening, and with the centre of gravity shifted so much to the side by the passengers preparing to disembark, a large wave struck the ferry. It capsized and sank very quickly, with no time to activate emergency equipment. 21 of Saratoga's crew lost their lives in the accident. On the first night of Desert Storm, Saratoga gained the unwelcome statistic of recording the first US casualty of the war. An FA-18 Hornet fighter, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Scott Spiker, was 100 miles west of Baghdad when it was shot down. The wreckage came down in uninhabited wasteland, and his remains were not discovered until the 2nd of August 2009. It was originally claimed by the US military that his F-18 was brought down by a surface-to-air missile, but a declassified 2001 CIA document revealed that he had actually been shot down in air-to-air combat, with most likely a MiG-25. During Operation Desert Storm, Saratoga moved repeatedly through the Suez Canal between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and throughout the hostilities would see 11,000 launch and recoveries of her aircraft. Such was her important role in the conflict, Iraq President Saddam Hussein claimed on TV that Iraqi forces had attacked and sunk the Saratoga. In reality, an unguided Scud missile had been launched in her direction, but missed by more than 100 nautical miles. Following Desert Storm, Saratoga arrived back in Mayport on the 28th of March 1991 to a hero's reception. In late 1992, USS Saratoga was taking part in Exercise Display Determination 92 as part of a large NATO fleet. It was during this exercise that another very regrettable incident occurred. The multinational forces were divided into 2 sections, with Saratoga being a part of the Brown forces, and as part of the opposition Green forces was the Turkish destroyer and minelayer TCG Muavinet. As part of the exercise, Brown amphibious forces were to attempt a landing at Saros Bay in the Aegean Sea, with the Green forces instructed to repel the invaders. On the 30th of September, close to midnight, the operation began. Saratoga, along with the rest of the battle group, were tasked with seeking and destroying any Green defences that would hinder the landing. At Saratoga's disposal were Standard missiles as well as Harpoon missiles. Also on board were Sea Sparrow missiles, which were there as anti-aircraft defences and were not expected to be used against land or sea targets. However, the Tactical Action Officer, the TAO, aboard Saratoga had decided to use the Sea Sparrow, and following approval from Saratoga's commanding officer and the battle group commander, the Sea Sparrow missile team were woken from their bunks and ordered to ready their stations. Not all members of the missile team were told that this was an exercise. The TAO, throughout the drills, was using language consistent with the firing of a live weapon, mainly as there was no standard terminology in place to differentiate between exercise and real world. The TAO ordered the Target Acquisition Systems operator to arm and tune. This order was again consistent with the intention to fire a live weapon. The Turkish ship Muavinet had been targeted. Shortly after midnight, on the 1st of October, 2 live Sea Sparrow missiles were launched and headed for the Turkish vessel. The missiles found their target, destroying the bridge and the Combat Information Centre. 5 sailors were killed, including the ship's commanding officer, and there were numerous injuries. Following the incident, Saratoga's commanding officer, Captain James Drager, 4 other officers and 3 enlisted men received non-judicial punishment, in effect ending their naval careers. The 2 sailors who actually fired the weapons did not receive any punishment. By 1994, USS Saratoga's eventful service life was brought to a close. She sailed to Mayport, Florida on the 20th of August 1994 and was decommissioned. To save her from the scrapyard, efforts were made in 1995 to convert her to a museum in Jacksonville, Florida. But the costs involved turned out to be prohibitive. An added stumbling block to the fundraising was that the city of Jacksonville had recently been awarded the NFL franchise, the Jacksonville Jaguars. As part of the deal in the award of the franchise was a commitment to fund the building of a new stadium at a cost of $130 million. There was simply not enough money for the stadium and the Saratoga Museum. Therefore, on the 21st of August 2014, Saratoga finally made her way to Brownsville, Texas, arriving on the 16th of September. Scrapping was completed on the 31st of March 2019. USS Saratoga, along with her class sisters, began the long line of US Navy supercarriers, and it's fitting that part of her is still at sea. Both of her anchors were reused in 1998 with the commissioning of USS Harry S. Truman. Thanks very much for watching. Please hit the like button and consider subscribing.